Hi, good morning, guys. I was to start off on uh, continue AKI, and it was supposed to classify it based on histological site of injury. So you can have a damage at the level of tubules, interstitium, vasculature, and glomeruli. In acute tubular necrosis, the setting of ischemia is less commonly external toxins and mostly ischemia. That's what we generally see. So the phases can be initiation phase, an extension phase, a maintenance phase, and a recovery. So in the initiation phase, you are going to have a decreased ATP because of decreased circulation, and these patients may have hypotension leading to tubular epithelial injury. With the extension, there can be microvascular congestion. These are all pathologic mechanisms of worsening of the ATN. So let me just put this as a screen easier. Alright, and this is what the pathology can look like. So causes are what is important. So any patient who comes to you with an AKI, it's extremely important to figure out what is the reason of the hypotension. That is the only way you can fix the leaking bucket. If you have a bucket that's leaking, and if you continuously pour water into it, it is not going to retain. So unless you fix the cause, you will not be able to figure out how to treat the hypotension permanently, or you will have a recurrence and the patient will succumb. Hypotension can be as a result of shock due to hemorrhagic problems, a cardiogenic shock, or sepsis. Now, hemorrhagic can be anything from a simple thing as a road traffic accident to anything like melena, hematemesis. Cardiogenic shock can usually be as an association with primarily a myocardial infarction or a secondary decompensation or worsening of a left ventricular failure. In a patient with sepsis, there can be several mechanisms of the hypotension, mostly prostaglandin mediated. There can be devascularization, there can be nephrotoxicity in the form of myoglobinuria. There can be a drop in the hemoglobin. There can be aminoglycoside use that can be nephrotoxic. Amphotericin can be one of the causes. Cisplatin and contrast mediated AKI is also known to happen. Now with sepsis, you are going to have, one second, sepsis associated AKI, also very common amongst what we treat. It is caused, a septic shock is when you have an underlying focus of infection associated with hypotension. That is what we call septicemic shock, septic shock, or sepsis, basically with hypotension. Okay, the lab findings are that you're going to find some place with an infection. Either it's a blood culture, or there is an obvious site of infection like an oozing wound, or there could be an abscess, or it could be malaria with secondary infection, or pneumonia with secondary infection. But you need to have the focus of infection to say that it is sepsis. Apart from that, your urine routine, which is very important to look into, can find granular and renal tubular epithelial cell cast. So you will see that finding in the urine routine. It's just a simple urine routine with which you can detect the patient is in acute kidney injury. So you have to look for granular and renal tubular epithelial cell casts that is detected by the microscopy. And then there is something called a fractional excretion of sodium, which is a lab test that can be asked for, and that is usually more than 1% in sepsis associated AKI. In these patients, a urine osmolality will be less than 500 milliosmoles per kg. But initially, the patient may have a FeNO of less than 1%. But just remember that FeNO in AKI is more than 1%. Ischemia associated AKI again can be because of systemic hypotension due to any reason. It can be superimposed with sepsis. It is more pronounced in old age. Also associated with, you can have a patient who is already a known case of chronic kidney disease that develops an acute on chronic kidney injury. Lab findings, you will see that they are granular and renal tubular epithelial cast, and the FeNO is again typically 1%, more than 1%. Nephrotoxin induced or endogenous nephrotoxin associated AKI can be causing crush injuries, seizures, in a patient with immobilization, any reason for elevated myoglobulin or a creatinine kinase, or patients with urine, and the patient will present with urine blood or with RBCs in the urine. It is associated with rhabdomyolysis. you will find a high potassium, you will find a high CPK in these patients, and that will tell you that this is most likely a rhabdomyolysis or an endogenous nephrotoxin associated AKI in a patient with a recent blood transfusion. And if the patient undergoes a transfusion reaction, there may be anemia, a high lactate dehydrogenase level, a low haptoglobulin level, which will all reflect hemolysis. If there is exposure to contrast media, for example, a patient comes with a recurrent headache, or a patient comes with a possible meningitis, and we want to do a contrast associated CT head or an MRI head, and post having been exposed to the contrast media, the patient develops AKI. It is associated, that is called contrast associated nephropathy. Usually the creatinine will be normal in the first 1 or 2 days after exposure, and it will peak up to 3 to 5 days later, and with the correct treatment there's normalcy or recovery within 7 days. Exogenous toxins include can induce AKI in the form of interstitial nephritis or tubular cell injury, a topic for another day as well, but I will talk about it a little briefly. You can have patients who have recent medication exposure in the form of NSAIDs mostly, or there may be history of a fever, rash, arthralgia that can predispose to interstitial nephritis. On lab examination, you may find that the patient has eosinophilia and sterile pyuria. Tubular injury may be associated with aminoglycoside use, cisplatin use, tenofovir and zoledronic acid. Not in every patient, but only in certain patients who are predisposed. In these patients, again, you're going to have granular renal tubular cell casts, and a FeNO, which is typically more than 1%. Intrinsic AKI, on the other hand, is an acute kidney injury that is associated with an intrinsic cause. For example, an autoimmune illness like vasculitis or glomerulonephritis. Also a topic for another day, but I will mention it briefly here so that you can remember that AKI causes can be pre-renal, renal or intrinsic, and post-renal. Coming to intrinsic causes are glomerulonephritis, vasculitis. The patient may present with things like a rash and arthralgia, sinusitis, a lung hemorrhage, or a recent skin or throat infection. You may want to look into the possibility of ANA, ANCA, AGM antibody, antiglomerular basement membrane antibody. If the patient has a hepatitis B or hepatitis C, that is also highly associated with interstitial nephritis. It's associated with the intrinsic AKI, and it may worsen to go in for a CKD. Kidney biopsy is the only way that you can determine the cause. Thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura and HUS, that's hemolytic uremic syndrome, can be associated with a recent GI infection. On peripheral smear in these patients, you may find schistocytes. There will be high LDH level, and the patient may have anemia, thrombocytopenia. Kidney biopsy is generally necessary for a proper evaluation. Interstitial nephritis, like I told you, drug-related nephritis may be there, okay, and Legionella infections can predispose to an intrinsic AKI as well. Atheroembolic disease, there may be a recent manipulation of an aorta, large vessels, or spontaneously after anticoagulation. There may be some history of an atheroembolic disease. Lab findings will find hypocomplementemia and eosinophilia with proteinuria. Skin biopsy is generally diagnostic. Then you have other causes of renal decompensation like multiple myeloma. So if an elderly patient with a low hemoglobin, a high ESR and a high creatinine, it is worth checking up on a myeloma workup, since it is common after the age of around 55 to 60, and with vague achy bones, pains everywhere. Okay. Intrinsic AKI management is almost the same. You have to find out the cause and bring about immunosuppression. It's usually an autoimmune cause, so you need to suppress the immune system by giving steroids or with plasmapheresis as recommended. If there is an acute interstitial nephritis as detected by the FeNO ratio or FeNO percentage, or when there's an obvious cause like use of NSAIDs, then you want to stop the offending agent and see only if a patient doesn't respond with stoppage of the medication, you may have to add some glucocorticoids. Scleroderma renal crisis may require steroids and ACE inhibitors. Rhabdomyolysis requires volume repletion, alkaline fluids to prevent tubular damage and cast formation, and of course diuretics, and sometimes the patients may need dialysis. General issues with ischemia and nephrotoxin associated AKI is that you have to replenish what is lost. So whether it is fluid or whether it is blood, replenishment of those two are extremely important. Okay, and initiation of a renal replacement therapy, that is dialysis, must be started when needed. Do not wait and see. Okay. um, in specific issues like tumor lysis syndrome, in certain patients wherein you start allopurinol because of for the help of tumor lysis, like usually in Hodgkin's lymphoma, etc. Allopurinol is started so that whatever breakdown happens, uric acid rise may happen, allopurinol will clear it up. So prevention is better than cure. Even many a times when we know that there's a patient who has a tendency to go into an AKI, we may start an acetylcysteine therapy and fluid replacement therapy in a patient who is about to go undergo a contrast mediated necessary procedure like an angiogram, angioplasty, to kind of prevent or at least reduce the damage on the kidneys. Okay. You can look for hyponatremia, hypokalemia, metabolic acidosis, hypophosphatemia, hypocalcemia, hypomagnesemia. Okay, drug dosing needs to be altered. Certain medications need a renal dose clearance, and you have to look into that. Contrast-induced AKI is not very common, but then it does happen. You need to alkalinize the fluids. You need to give lots of sodium bicarb for this patient to prevent contrast media-induced AKI. It induces diuresis and it allows the contrast to be flushed out of the body a little sooner and therefore prevent damage overall. It's not required for every patient. But again, basis is volume management, electrolyte and acid-base abnormality management. If there will be malnutrition because there may be protein loss and there may be fat loss, and for that you need to look into the underlying cause. Apart from that, you need to look into the um, um, uh, protein loss as well. Okay, anemia may be there, that needs to be treated. A protein electrophoresis for plasma cell dyscrasias, immunoglobulin evaluation for vasculitis, SLE, and HIV myeloma can be done. An RA factor can also be done. Post-renal AKIs are usually associated with prostatic disease, account for less than 5% of AKIs, and they're usually pretty commonly seen. They're easy to pick up. You will have some symptoms to suggest prostatic disease, necrolithiasis, etc. Pelvic and paraortic malignancies may also predispose to post-renal AKI. Signs will also be associated with the colicky flank pain radiating to groin, nocturia, urinary frequency, hesitancy, abdominal fullness, and suprapubic pain. You may want to put the patient through just an ultrasound, which may be enough in some cases, but most of the times they need a proper CT. And if you relieve the urinary tract obstruction in these patients, either with a transurethral or a suprapubic catheterization, it definitely reduces the burden. It reduces the reflux of urine, and it helps a lot. Percutaneous nephrostomy may be used also in erythral stent latency. So when do you do a renal biopsy for patients? When there is a rapidly progressive AKI and you are not sure of the cause. If you are suspecting a systemic vasculitis that is associated or affecting the kidney, then you might need to. Myeloma, CAS, nephropathy sometimes requires, and atheroembolic disease sometimes requires. Okay, these are the potential implications, but most of the times we do it only for diagnosis. For treatment, we usually already would have started before that. Okay, uremia can cause, since clinically the patient may come in a confused manner, they may have bleeding complications because of loss of protein and a reduction in the anticoagulation mechanisms. Because of the protein loss involved, the patient may have vomiting because of the uremia as well. There may be an expansion of the extracellular volume. There might be weight gain. There will be third spacing of the fluid, so the patient will present with pedal edema, pleural effusions, ascites, periorbital swelling, etc. There may be dependent edema. There may be a raised JVP, and there may be pulmonary edema as well. When it comes to electrolyte imbalances, look for hyponatremia. It is usually dilutional, does not require sodium replacement therapy. It just requires that you balance out the fluids correctly by bringing back the fluid from the third space into the intracellular volume, intravascular space. Then hyperkalemia may be there. If the hyperkalemia is persistent, this may warrant a patient to undergo a dialysis. Okay, it's one of the reasons as to why we may dialyze a patient. If other measures like potassium binding agents and other measures like insulin IV and glucose IV may not help. High anion gap metabolic acidosis can also be corrected with the correction of the hypertension, and sometimes we are bound to give sodium bicarbonate. Bleeding, infections, arrhythmias, pericarditis can happen, but it's a little rare. Malnutrition if it's long standing. Review, always hydrate the patient very well. Eliminate the toxin, whatever it may be, whether it's NSAIDs or the rhabdomyolysis that has happened, or contrast media. Perform tests frequently so that you can make sure that the patient is not progressing, and assess when renal biopsy is needed, and consider referring. Of course, in our case, we refer all cases because we're a tertiary care center and we do have a nephrologist with us. So for backup and for medical legal reasons, we do advise or we do request the nephrologist to come and just confirm our treatment and give us a go ahead. And dialysis is usually recommended based on what he decides. Okay, he's the best person to tell us that with his experience and his stuff. So which fluids to use? We try to use isotonic saline in most cases. Rarely use synthetic colloids unless there is a very refractory hypotension and we are not able to find the blood group or whatever the case may be. I've never had to use it. Colloids are generally avoided in the medical cases. Sodium bicarbonate is only given in certain cases wherein there is refractory hypotension, refractory acidosis, and dialysis we are planning to give dialysis for some reason. There is a delay in the dialysis, and yes, we do give some bicarbonate. So how much fluid? Something that will reduce the tachycardia. That means that the intravascular fluid component is replenished. If there is an improvement in the peripheral perfusion, if the BP is coming up from hypotension to almost normal at least, when the JVP goes from, when it is now visible. In cases of dehydration, you're not going to be able to see JVP. In case of fluid overload, you may see. So it depends on what presentation you're looking at. And if the patient is putting out urine, then you're doing the right thing and you're going in the right direction. So just keep at it. Okay. Replacement all depends upon the degree of hypovolemia, whether the patient is oliguric or not. Usually we give about first liter over 2 hours, then second liter over 4 hours, and third liter over 6 hours. Minimum of 30 ml per hour urine must be formed and put out. So we usually catheterize these patients, or at least put in a condom catheter if not indwelling in these patients. Okay. Insensible losses may be more for a little febrile patient because of sweating and tachypnea, mouth breathing, and all of those things. So we need to take all these things into consideration. If the patient is malnourished, you can, if the patient is malnourished, you can give high protein diet right from the beginning. Otherwise, after 5 days, you can start giving a normal diet for this particular patient. Enteral feeding is always definitely, that means oral or RT feeding can be given rather than giving parenteral albumin and all those things. Do not overprescribe those things. And that's the end of AKI. So next week I'll talk to you guys about probably interstitial nephritis in a little bit more detail, or renal associated AKI in a little bit more detail. Thanks guys.